Hey there, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third segment of our True Talk Thursday podcast. We are going to turn to Dr. Maria Armstrong and Dr. Atiba-Weza to continue the conversation today.
Atiba, you brought a question to Cristina, and can you go ahead and restate that question so she can lead us into that?
Preference in it with some of the words of Frantz Fanon, who talked about language and the racial and ethnic identity. And he talked about the role of language, that language plays in racial alienation, objectification, and dehumanization within a colonial context. But I was suggesting that it goes beyond the colonial context. He was writing back then in the late 1960s what it meant, but today in 2021, we still see a lot of that. And I was just merely asking, and now, especially now that the census is about to be certified, and what that really means in terms of people being marginalized, not being recognized, and so forth. And as part of your research, Cristina, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I do work on the census more broadly. In 2012, the census really began studying in earnest, how do Latinos, but also how do racial groups in America, like what terms do they use? How do they define themselves? How do they see themselves? Right now, for the most part, the Bureau has kept up with its practice since forever, except for a blip in 1930. They continuously classify all Latinos as white. So this is why you have this separate question of, are you Hispanic/Latino? And then it's not sort of an option on the race category. Well, since at least the 1970s that they've been tracking it, they've seen a real headache with this problem, in part because large segments, upwards of 40, maybe 50%, don't see themselves as white, in part because the idea of whiteness in America has often excluded racial minorities, have often excluded also the idea of Latinos. In fact, it makes me think of in 2003, when I started grad school, one of the biggest books that was published that year was a book by Samuel Huntington, who was a pretty famous political scientist in Harvard. And his book was titled, "Who Are We? The Hispanic Challenge to the Nation," right? And it was a lot about how Latinos were not American, they were not assimilating, they were not sort of the good immigrants, the way Irish and Italians. And, this isn't just Sam Huntington, this is a history of exclusion in the nation. And so the Bureau has this issue of where to put them, right? And in 2017, after much study and much sort of thinking this through focus groups, they decided that they would have a combined question, what they call the combined question. The question would have then, what is your race/ethnicity? I think one version would have had color. No, what is your race/ethnicity? And it would have had an option of Asian, and then you put in Japanese, Chinese. It would have had an option of Latino/Hispanic. It would have had an option African-American, etc. This was seen as yielding the highest quality data because you wouldn't get the 40% missing data that you would have had if you're just sort of trying to categorize them as white. And you wouldn't have this inflation of this category called some other race, where if you look at that data, upwards of 90% of people that say some other race are Latino, or like who we would think Latino. And you wouldn't have this like awkward separate question, right? They went through, that was their best expert recommendation. But in 2017, 2018, the president of the United States was Donald Trump, who put in as the head of commerce, Wilbur Ross, who quickly disliked this idea. And despite expert recommendation, years of study, put an axe on the project, said no.
No me digas.
So not only did he put an axe on that project, they also argued and lobbied and almost got a citizenship question on the Census Bureau, right, on the Census Bureau form. And if anyone has followed any of those politics, we know that one of the forceful arguments about why sort of arguments from the state of New York, the state of California, about why this was bad is that it was anti-Latino and meant to suppress Latino representation on census forms, right? So you had two things. You had this sort of awkward question that we know gives us missing data that takes a long time to recategorize, and that in some ways creates a sense of symbolic violence because it makes Latinos, forces them to think and see of themselves as either white, Black, Asian, Native American, or Pacific Islander, right? When we know that this country has a history of sort of treating Latinos as a whole as other, right? Although there is variation within the community. And then we suddenly have the census citizenship question. And, you know, had the election gone a different way, had we, you know, continued, full force with sort of thinking about citizenship and then thinking about sort of how we would, do political representation by just those citizens, this would have been a really different census effort. Now, 2020 census still has now the imperfect Latino categories. It does have, it doesn't have the citizenship question, so perhaps we don't have the dampening, but there were other politics that happened with the pandemic. For example, the Census Bureau under Wilbur Ross decided that it would cut its time in the field shorter, even though we know that the pandemic created all kinds of delays for people of color to fill out the census forms. And so in all these ways, sort of the state sort of creates opportunities for forcing people to see themselves in certain ways, recoding them. When you've got a category called Sum of the Race and 90% of it is Latino filling it out, you've got a problem with the way you're thinking about Latinos, right? And so maybe for 2030, now we will wait for 2030, things might be different. We might have a president that listens to the scientific experts and does things differently. But unfortunately, when I think about symbolic violence and I think about the power of the state to tell us who we are and deny us opportunities to truly express ourselves in the way we would like, I think about just how much power the state has, because look at the organizations, look at school districts across the country. Mm-hmm. When they create their categories, almost all of them say, we're just following census categories. Exactly. We're just following OMB, right? Which then reproduces the sense of this is who you are because this is who the state is, right? Who are we supposed to be then, right?
Exactly.
Even if from the ground, yeah. So it makes me think of that. I think the second thing, in your first iteration of the question, you suggested that there were not only ways the state sees us, but also inequalities within communities, right? Even within that might have the same label. And I think when we get to these positions of thinking about Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, they create also really important moments of understanding the inequalities we reproduce amongst ourselves. Lots of the arguments about Latinx were about anti-LGBT sentiment within the community. We're about anti-transgender sentiment. We're about a reckoning, created spaces for us to talk about Latina and Latino culture as sort of, and what it was doing to really create inclusivity, right? And in many ways, I see that as an upside. If you think of Chicano, let's go back to Chicano and Mexican. And Maria, you might know more, but the arguments for Chicano were really about the importance of awakening of a political identity, of saying, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not just Mexican. We are here. We've been treated like this, and we pledge ourselves to a new politics and identity of expression for self-liberation and opportunity for our community. And in many ways, even just provide, that didn't mean that everyone took that label, but it didn't mean that the sort of creation or so the argument for that label created this space for dialogue. And I think that's important. We're not ever going to have a perfect label.
Yeah.
But if we can create these moments for dialogue, I think we'll be better for it.
The borders crossed us. We didn't cross the borders. I mean, that was like the anthem behind it, you know? Great question, Atiba.
Oh, thank you, Maria.
You know, we
There's
got
a
one, I know we're over time, but we kind of got a late start. So we have one more question if we could toss to you, Cristina, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, you know, since Latinos are now the new, what's that?
I didn't hear a word you said, unless it's my connection, but you were breaking up as you're coming through.
Okay. Should I want me to restate that?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we have one more question that we would like to toss out to Cristina before we wrap up. And that question is, since Latinos are now the new minority majority, how do you think using the label Latinx will play out? And will it divide us or unite us? Let me give you a little bit of context of where that question's coming from.
Sure.
Coming out here to DC, because you know I'm originally from the West Coast, but coming out here to DC, it's been interesting because, like you said, we're all tossed into this one bucket, right? Panamanian, Colombian, lo que sea, we're all in this, right? And yet on the East Coast, I was told by my East Coast folks that, you know, you got to use the term Latinx because, you know, that's what you got to use out here. And then on the West Coast, you know, they're like, we still claim Latino. And then in my central, you know, regional areas, they're like, no, we're Hispanic. So it's like, mi gente, how do we, you know, which is what really was the start of this whole podcast, is to bring people to an understanding, a better understanding, I really want to say, about labels and terms within our own, right? Before we venture out and say, hey, we want you to call us this, when we don't even know what we're calling ourselves. So I tossed that question out that, you know, rather than having an East Coast, West Coast, Central, you know, brouhaha, how do we use these terms to unite rather than divide?
Yeah, how to use them to unite rather than divide. I think one way is to use a bunch of them, is to not argue that one is more correct than the other, and to make space for the way people want to use this. And to be okay and not think that this means that we're unstable or, you know, we don't got it together because we've got different terms. I think that's the best way. You know, if folks still want to use Latino, then so be it. But if a student of yours wants to use Latinx because they see this as, you know, a true reflection of their gender politics, of who they are and what we should be, let them.
Absolutely.
And then let's write it out.
Yeah.
Let's have these dialogues. Let's have these dialogues here. Let's have these dialogues, you know, philosophically. Let's have these dialogues in the academy. And let's get to a place when we have these dialogues, we come to a place of a better understanding of who we want to be, right? The world continues to change. Exactly. We change, right? This is a moment of racial reckoning. This is a moment then also that calls us to be, you know, people that will be change agents, right? That calls us to be folks that understand the inequalities that are happening, right? And part of that includes these dialogues as we move forward. And so don't shy away from them. Don't use the sort of simple thing of like, no, we use this, or no, that's wrong, or no, that's just the youth, right? Understand them and sort of engage in this and make that space, I think.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Atiba, do you want to wish our amazing guest a farewell, or I think we need to bring her back at some point. What do you think?
First, I want to thank her for gracing us with her presence and the information which you presented there, Cristina, because this is an issue that is not going to go away overnight. One of the questions in the chat was the whole notion of, you know, him, he, I, those things that people put in their email.
Pronouns.
And whether
Pronouns.
that's a professional, standard in the future. And it is important that people fight for their identity. I mean, you think of the Native Americans and what has happened. And I know, for example, I have friends from Honduras and friends from Belize, where there was a time when that was one place until the Spanish and the English just put a boundary down there, and one became English speaking, one became Spanish speaking, relatives on different sides of the border.
Yeah.
So racial and ethnic language identity is critical for us, and as educators who will be working with these young people as they come here, we have got to help them to maintain their identity, be proud in who they are, and make sure that they're fully integrated in our learning communities. Otherwise, they can easily become marginalized, and then next thing you know, the education to which they are entitled is not oftentimes given to them. So, Cristina, I just want to thank you very much for shedding some light here, and I hope our audience will be have been as enlightened as I have been.
Yeah, and I just really want to thank you too, Cristina, because it's an evolutionary process, and if we don't evolve, then we die. We have to adapt, because just as once we were young and we were fighting for our status, whatever that term was at that point, we've got the young ones coming up the ranks, and there's room for it all of it. That's the beauty of life. That's the beauty of growth. And for that, we thank you so much, and shedding the light on this subject, as Atiba said. And we're going to have you back somehow, some way. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.